John Lennon's early life was marred by trauma and inconsistent parenting. John was born during an intense German bombing raid while his father, Alfred, a merchant marine, was off fighting the war. Bomb blasts and air raid sirens welcomed John into a world that lacked a paternal presence. John could not set himself apart from the trauma of having literally been born into World War II. His mother, Julia, often left him with her sister Mimi while she went out to party. John's mother had a laissez-faire parenting style, while her sister Mimi, while loving, was strict and authoritarian. Due to this great inconsistency in parenting styles, John later clearly struggled when he didn't have someone, a parental figure, telling him what to do. Stabilizing figures who emerged later in John's life include Beatles manager Brian Epstein, bandmate Paul McCartney, the Maharishi, and second wife Yoko Ono. From a very early age, John often witnessed his mother returning home drunk, frequently with a new lover. Due to the instability of John's mother and the absence of his father, when John was 4, he was placed in the care of his Aunt Mimi. Though John moved back in with his mother 2 years later, due to the volatility with his mother, he would often run away to his aunt's home. John's needs as a baby, as a toddler, and as a young child were simply not met. And the unstable shuffling between Mimi and Julia led to John's insecurities, undisciplined behavior, and poor attitudes toward women. John's adolescence and sexual awakening were marked by a display of his distorted views of women. He views females as sex objects and has recurring memories of being sexually attracted to his mother. His Oedipus complex is a sign of being in the phallic stage of psychosexual development. When John's uncle George died, he starts spending more time with his mother, but begins seeing her more as a friend than as a mother. This confuses John's feelings toward her even more. Between the absence of love, the lack of a male role model, and general tension that existed in his early life, John appears also to be stuck in the oral psychosexual stage of development. John mastered playing the harmonica by the age of 7. His act of singing stimulates his mouth and provides a sense of safety that he never received as a child. John goes on to become the most sarcastic member of the Beatles, which is an illustration of his oral aggressiveness. John also habitually chews gum and smokes. He tries quitting smoking, but he was never able to do so. So the lack of parental authority, along with his birth mother being killed by a drunk off-duty police officer, greatly influenced John's personality. This resulted in a general distrust of others, particularly of authority figures. John was rebellious in school and took to displacing his aggression on other school kids, and by drawing disturbing images of his teachers, of handicapped children, as well as Nazi imagery. John thrived on a negative attention received by disrupting classes, disobeying his teachers, and getting into fights. He became authoritarian in nature and displayed strong leadership skills, though the skill was often misdirected into negative activities. John had witnessed physical violence between his parents, and he too became aggressive toward women. In his song, Getting Better, John reflects on his past abusive behavior. He says, "I couldn't express myself and I hit. I fought men and I hit women. That is why I'm always on about peace, you see. It is the most violent people who go for love and peace. Everything's the opposite. But I sincerely believe in love and peace. I am a violent man who has learned not to be violent." Due to John's extramarital promiscuity, John and his first wife Cynthia divorced just 6 months into their marriage. John referred to his second wife, Yoko Ono, as Mother, and even wrote a song about her with this title, another sign of his Oedipus complex. The structure of John's personality will be examined in a session that follows. His id, the pleasure principle, has powerful influence on his behavior. His absence of ego strength resulted from his developmental and socialization tasks being unmet as a child. His superego is interesting in that he portrays himself as being one for peace and love, when his lived reality was rather filled with chaos, abandonment, and violence. John strives to appear peaceful, while he abuses others and himself in a symbolic form due to his extremely negative judgments toward himself. John experiences many forms of defense mechanisms. Along with displacement, other defense mechanisms include repression, reaction formation, sublimation, and regression. In terms of repression, John never directly expresses his feelings of abandonment or fear in his music. These feelings were simply too painful for him to bring into consciousness. Being born in the time of war, he uses reaction formation, writing songs about peace and love to ward off his destructive and hurtful impulses. Such songs include Imagine, Give Peace a Chance, Let It Be, and All You Need Is Love. John sublimates his dark shadow impulses into the creation of music and art with positive themes. John shows regression by taking drugs and drinking alcoholically, despite the negative impact it has on his life. He is recapitulating the sensation of being a child in the womb, completely protected and sustained. This substance abuse hurts his career by lowering his productivity and harms his interpersonal relationships due to his being prone to violent outbursts when intoxicated. He forms a Hollywood drinking society with his musician buddies known as the Hollywood Vampires, which accounted for several lost years in his life. His neurotic anxiety of losing control of his instincts and his moral anxiety of fearing his own conscience led to his reliance on these defense mechanisms. John's treatment will begin by uncovering the meaning of his various symptoms that cause his aberrant behavior, as well as the repressed memories that interfere with his healthy functioning.
Tell me about your dream from last night.
I had a dream that I lived in a castle. It had a moat with a large alligator in it. There was a chapel inside the castle. The chapel felt like the most important room of the whole castle. It was beautiful. It had a picture of Jesus, and there were pictures of a member of my family, like all in order going up the steps like you see in people's homes.
So far, you've told me a story that mimics the setup of your personality. Your ego is the moat. It is the barrier between your inside and outside worlds. The alligator symbolizes the aggression and sexuality that can spring out of your ego at any time. The chapel is your superego. It has all of the moralistic features that define your life. Religion, as well as your family members, have laid down the contents inside it. The castle itself represents that you have some kind of grip on reality. It may be surrounded by the unknown, but you've carved out for yourself a structure that has a past, present, and future. Tell me more about the dream.
I was in the dining hall in the castle, sitting at a large table like the kind you see kings and queens sitting at, one of those long tables. And my mom and dad were coming, but they were very late, and I was extremely disappointed that they hadn't shown up. I was just about to bag it when they both arrived. They had these weird looks on their faces. I don't know, it's sort of deranged and happy at the same time. So they sat down, and without them saying a word, the waiter brought my dad 2 walnuts and my mom 2 mangoes. They both pushed their plates toward me and asked if I was ready. I said I wasn't and that I was scared. So they took their plates back and started feeding each other. As they did, a large candle that was burning in the middle of the table began getting bigger and brighter. For some reason I became jealous. I wanted something, but I wasn't quite sure what I wanted. My mom had eaten only 1 mango, so I reached for her plate. My dad slapped my hand. I got very frightened and ran out of the room.
You are very insecure about your parents' presence. This manifests in the dream by them being late. Not only the literal timing, but you are uncomfortable by them being close to you. You're not watching the time for lateness, but rather when it is your time to face your fears. The main content of this portion is your fixation at the phallic stage. You acknowledge that your parents are both sexual beings, yet you deny what they have to offer you. Instead, your unconscious creates anxiety as a distraction, but you can't help notice the growth of something that represents a phallus. Since you desire fulfillment of your sexual drive that is unavoidable, you gravitate towards your mother, but your dad is competing with you and slaps your hand. You run because you're afraid he will cut your penis off. The term I've coined for this is castration anxiety. It's clear at this point that if you don't handle this aspect of your life, then you will have no one, as this problem is intimately tied with the only other 2 people in your dream and your life. Tell me the rest of the dream.
Well, when I fled the dining hall, I was planning on running away from the castle, but my dad started chasing me. Immediately I thought of going to the alligator and asking him to eat my dad. When I got onto the bridge over the moat and went to call the alligator, a beam of light from the chapel came down and blinded me, and I froze. I couldn't move. My dad arrived shortly after and was going to kill me for disrespecting him. He pulled out a knife and looked as if he was going to stab me, but suddenly I realized that if I looked like him, perhaps then he wouldn't have stabbed me. My paralysis started wearing off and I was able to contort my body to mimic his aggressive demeanor. I saw a tear fall from his face. He had seen himself in me, I guess. He helped me up and we began walking back toward the castle. As I looked back, I saw that new trees had sprung up in the wilderness surrounding our castle, and the world appeared larger to me.
John, the running in your dream is quite literal of what you're doing. You're moving as fast as you can from the responsibility you missed from 3 to 6 years of age. You turn to the alligator because you are usually aggressive, not only with your dad, but any event that arouses this Oedipal conflict. You were hoping that aggression or meaningless sex could solve you being chased down by these impulses. When you were struck by the beam of light, your superego conflicted with your ego, which you were amidst the moat when struck by the beam of light. You wanted to let your alligator out, but your urge to kill was stunned by the superego's adherence to religion and to the perceived disapproval of other family members who were not as violent. The resolution of the phallic stage usually proceeds through identification with the father. Now we come to understand where your issues lie. You identified only with the aggressive part of him. Since this has been successful enough, it has been maintained, but it's as if you are fighting for your life. As you look back, the trees grow because you made it through this encounter. And although you didn't have full contact with it, you grew a little bit. The trees represent more unconscious territory becoming visible to your conscious mind. You have expanded your world. What you need to do is learn more about your father. Make sure that you learn the different sides of him. If you cannot find out directly, then learn stories from others. This desire to identify with him is a necessary step in normal development. Your unconscious will seek it out, so have something good for it to latch on to. When you notice yourself being like him, remember to make sure it stays on a positive note. Make the inclination move towards more of your goals with only a tinge of his. Stop the beating and fighting that you once witnessed in him. Use his strength to continue to build your brand and legacy. Continue to love your wife. Quit turning away in fear that it might step on somebody's toes. You need to give in fully, appreciate her sensually. The anxiety is from the past. You were afraid of becoming your true self. After you have experienced her fully, without a sense of anxiety, then you will have resolved the fear that love results in death. John, I'm going to say a word, and I want you to say the first thing that comes to mind. Remember, there's no good or bad answer. Just say whatever occurs to you, the first thing, John, whatever comes to mind. The trees in your dream were an important element. Let's start with that. So, trees.
Forest.
Forest.
Outdoors.
Outdoors.
Sun.
Sun.
Peace.
Peace.
Love.
Love.
War.
Peace to love to war. John, do you realize that you don't associate love with only peace? You associate love with war.
How's that?
When I said peace, you said love. But when I said love, you said war. Based on what I know about you, in your childhood, war and love always went hand in hand. So, on the one hand, you seek peace and love, you want love to lead to peace and vice versa, but you experience love as hostile, something that you fear will kill you, much like a war. Your unconscious prevents you from making a meaningful connection in your relationships, experiencing that love, because it would be a war. Love relationships are something that you don't find yourself relaxed in. You're always waiting for something to pop off. And you protect yourself from this terrible fear by becoming aggressive, blacking out with the use of drugs and alcohol. That in and of itself is a form of violence. Your unconscious has been recasting the situation. Now that you're aware of this, you should start to feel differently.
Before discussing the sessions themselves, one should cover the preceding events that led to the sessions. Prior to these sessions, the therapist had worked with the client for a few months and began compiling an understanding of his unconscious conflicts. The stage of therapy that they are in now is laden with transference, although the content in these sessions pertain more to John than the therapist. The techniques used were dream interpretation and word association. The two goals of these techniques are to make the unconscious become conscious and to increase ego strength. One technique that is implicit in these sessions is interpretation, which is why the therapist would inform John of the deeper meaning of his experiences. Another technique that was implicit was maintaining the analytic framework. John had been told in advance the precise rules on when to come to therapy, how to pay, and if the client should ever contact the therapist outside of the session hour, amongst other things. These parameters ensured the client took the therapy seriously and provided structural elements that lacked in his early life. During the sessions, Lennon has shown he is fixated at the oral stage of development as well as the phallic stage. He has a deep preoccupation with his parents. After all, they are the only people that appear in his dream. He worries about them being absent and almost gives up on them. The therapist knows from his loved ones that he is ambivalent in his relationships. Sometimes he's persistently attached, at other times he can become physically aggressive. This preoccupation with his parents is a double entendre in the dream. He's not only worried about their absence, but also their presence. By not accepting the food they had to offer, he was refusing the sexual experiences he wanted to have. This is evidenced by the candle growing for an unknown reason. At last, he eventually is jealous and does go for his mother's fruit. But by then he has felt the competition from his father, experienced anxiety, and flees. The therapist points out that what happens next is his typical mode of being. He gets angry in response to deep encounters on a sexual level or love that could lead to sex. By seeing the connection between the dream and his lived experience, he has to face his Oedipal complex, which up to this point he has been completely unaware of. He was shown that his incomplete identification with his father is the reason he experiences anxiety towards relationships still. He copes with this anxiety through aggression and meaningless sex embodied by the alligator. He has mentioned that he feels guilty for the way he behaves in previous sessions, and this can be observed in the dream by his powerful superego stopping him with a beam of light. This is his sense of religion and his family's opinion. The real resolution is identifying with the positive elements of his father, so he never has to feel in competition with his father. He can quit running to the alligator or aggression in the first place. In the second technique, word association is similar in its style to free association. It gives the therapist an opportunity to see where the client shows resistance. This would indicate that the client is fixated at some point in their development, as most of the personality is formed by age 6. Most responses will be benign, such as John responding outdoors to the word forest. Even peace and love, which he associated, are very common, and this is an unproblematic situation. By the time John arrived at love, he exposed an issue from his past: war. John's background is replete with war, and his parents also experienced the shame and fear one goes through not being able to make things perfect. Being a child, he couldn't distinguish between love and war, experiencing them at the same time. He also didn't separate himself from the turmoil, and his unconscious is protecting him from the awareness that he is disgusting like war. This is why he constantly writes about peace and love in his songs. This is a defense mechanism called reaction formation. By constantly embracing peace, he never has to face that he's consumed by war. Knowledge of the abuse that occurs in his friendships and relationships makes sense, and that he feels he needs to strike first, much the same as if he is in a battle. But he is blind to it because he constantly thinks of the benevolent aspects of the world. This was pointed out to John, and the insight is the main curative factor in that session. In the next 8 weeks of therapy, the therapist seeks to enter the phases of working through and resolution of transference. The working through will be continually exploring with John how he is working on getting out of the oral and phallic fixation, with a special emphasis on transference and the other defense mechanisms employed by his unconscious. Aside from reaction formation, he's prone to regression, repression, denial, and projection. All of these will be interpreted through the course of therapy so that the underlying conflicts cannot continue to be enacted. His ego strength will be encouraged and supported by the therapist when he seems to be less dependent and has identification with more positive paternal qualities. Free association will be used, and dream analysis will both be used. Not only will they elaborate on conflicts that originated in his past, but they will be useful to see how John will act to the current shifting climate in therapy, and seeing if he can effectively be vulnerable in the present. It is anticipated that he will regress to avoid the anxiety of becoming fully independent, not only from his mother and father, but from the therapist who he has projected much of their qualities onto. His main way of doing so will be by using substances and displaying aggression towards others. By the last 2 weeks, the client should have mostly resolved his transference. The major task for John will be to return to life with his own support, making sure that he doesn't turn to drugs or abusive tactics to avoid the anxiety of being independent and fully in touch with all of his drives.